From the boogeyman of the lightweight division to not getting a win in nearly 4 years, Tony Ferguson was once on a 12-fight win streak, and after one loss, he hasn't looked the same. It could mean his time is up, but with Tony, you never know. He was pretty good in his prime. If you're a new fan of the UFC that got introduced to the sport during COVID, you haven't witnessed El Cucuy at his best. The man was scary, and it wasn't because of dominant grappling or crazy striking ability. He just went after his opponents as soon as the bell rang. Ferguson was known for many things, but most importantly, he'd never take a step back in a fight, always moving forward and putting a pace on his opponents. He also had unbelievable cardio because of the way he trained. And trust me, it would take days to discuss his training methods in detail. The guy did everything his way, and it worked out perfectly for him. He'd eat a lot of shots every fight, but it wouldn't matter. If you drop Tony in a fight, he's got you right where he wants you. As a black belt student of Eddie Bravo, Ferguson developed a lethal guard game, and he used that to get submissions as well as cut people open from the bottom. And that, of course, was because of his elbows from hell. There was a famous meme circulating in 2019 with all of Tony's past opponents, and they were all busted up. You don't just have to worry about losing, you might never look the same after fighting that guy. And you know what this did for him? It got him one of the longest win streaks ever. It's one thing to have all the attributes and dominance like Nurmagomedov, but Tony's case was different. He did everything wrong, but he still kept on winning. It was that madness which made him unpredictable, both in his fighting style and as a person. After losing to Michael Johnson, Tony started racking up wins. Most of the fights were wars, but El Cucuy was getting the job done. And very soon, it was time for him to fight for the belt. He was matched up against the Eagle on many occasions, but the fight kept falling apart. I'll get to that later, but as he kept winning, a title shot was inevitable. But the reigning champ at the time was off doing boxing events with Floyd Mayweather, so Tony fought for the interim title against Kevin Lee in a fight that was back and forth. But ultimately, Ferguson got him tired and secured a submission from the bottom.
Ferguson threw that straight kick a moment ago, tried to go right up the middle with it. Final seconds of the second round. Getting back this attempt. Well, listen into both corners.
All was going well for him, and he was set to fight Nurmagomedov finally for the vacant belt. But the most unpredictable thing happened. Tony tripped on a cable and dislocated his ACL. I guess if you've been around for a while, you're aware of the cable incident. Just 1 week before UFC 223, during the media day, Ferguson tripped on a cable and had to be pulled from the card. Many people thought it was an April Fool's joke, but unfortunately, it wasn't. Ferguson was told that he'd be out for at least a year by the doctor, and that his knee may never be the same again. But Tony, being Tony, took matters into his own hand and decided to step back into the cage in 6 months.
Done.
Well,
Do you think
because
maybe
of the
that played a part in?
retaliation.
Maybe that's
It's because of the retaliation tactics.
Yeah, but do you think
To
maybe
keep
that played a
somebody
part though?
To keep the part where it needed to go, and I know it burned you.
He fought former champ Anthony Pettis at UFC 229 as a co-main event with Khabib and Conor, and Tony put on a show. He and Pettis got Fight of the Night and Fight of the Year honors. It was a bloodbath and was stopped after Pettis broke his hand. It was clear that he had earned a shot at the belt now, but the MMA gods decided to screw him again when Nurmagomedov jumped the octagon and got suspended.
Ferguson's hitting him very hard. Pettis needs to get on his bike and start moving. He can't sit here like this.
An interim title fight was scheduled, and Tony refused to fight for an interim belt again. With that, Dustin Poirier became an interim champion after beating Max Holloway, and Tony fought veteran Cowboy Cerrone, which would be the last win of his career. Ferguson was now on a 12-fight win streak and had never fought for the undisputed title. It was long in coming, and the cursed fight between Khabib and Tony was booked again. It had been canceled 4 times, but they were both on a 12-fight win streak, and no one could beat them but each other. And just when you think it might have finally worked out, he couldn't fight Khabib due to COVID restrictions. And just like that, the curse continued. Tony fought for an interim belt yet again against Justin Gaethje, and this time he ended up losing badly. It was a hard fight to watch. Tony's toughness made it even worse for him, as he took more fight-ending shots than I've ever seen a man take. Gaethje got the stoppage win in the 5th round after the ref had seen enough. It was heartbreaking to see the man finally lose in such a devastating fashion. fashion. And since then, it's only gotten worse. Tony lost to Do Bronx by getting dominated and nearly getting his arm snapped off, and the losses kept on piling up after that.
Let's see what happens, because he hits him. Oh my goodness,
man.
it's a jab. And look.
But I mean, it's just
look,
enough.
He's
it's
shaking
like,
his head.
Yeah.
It's like,
oh.
look. And when you see Tony Ferguson do that,
Yeah,
like
for sure.
this drunken kung fu thing he's doing here, like this is just because of the.
After losing to Beneil, the very worst thing happened in the next one. Tony's chin was finally cracked by Chandler. Despite a much better performance in the first round of the fight, the legendary chin of El Cucuy couldn't stand Chandler's power. One front kick to the face, and Tony was on the wrong end of a highlight reel KO. It was as brutal as it gets, and anyone who knows the fight game knew it was the beginning of the end. Ferguson hasn't looked the same, and his last fight against Nate Diaz proved that. You could tell that he wasn't the same by the way both guys were engaging, and the icing on the cake was Tony tapping to a guillotine. The same guy who wouldn't tap when his arm was almost snapped off.
I'm gonna be real, it's been an honor to come in here and fight for you fans. No, Joe, it was fun.
You had always thought that maybe you and Nate were gonna fight, because you were always.
The fans were happy that night because Nate got to stick it to the UFC, but the retirement discussions had started that night for Ferguson. Since the 12-fight win streak, he's lost by knockout, submission, and dominant decisions. Even Tony realizes it, and he decided to go to college after his last loss. You don't see a 39-year-old fighter with kids go back to college, but I guess Tony's the type of guy to do just that. There have been many posts on his social media of him going to Harvard and attending classes. Now, fighters like Ben Askren call BS because they don't think Tony is smart enough to go to Harvard. Rude, but also true. Now, I don't think Tony will post proof of whether or not he's actually going to Harvard, but he's talked about going back to college for a long time, and it would mean he'd take some time off from fighting. After losing 5 in a row, most fighters would get immediately, but being a legend of the sport has its own privileges. The former interim champ will be turning 40 soon, and in a division like lightweight, it's highly unlikely that he'd make his way back to his title.
That's what you guys got. You got 4 rounds carnage. Last minute replacement, I would have liked a little bit more time, but I'm back, man. Gotta fix some mistakes, and I love my crew.
It's always hard to see your heroes fall, but in combat sports, it just keeps on happening. But the 12-fight win streak of El Cucuy will always remain legendary. He truly was the boogeyman of the division, and the guy who everyone thought could beat Khabib. But even now, no one would be surprised by Mr. Unpredictable coming back better than ever. And even if he decides to hang it up, he'd go down as one of the best to ever do it at lightweight. Well, that's all I have on the curious case of Tony Ferguson.